All right, so when we're looking at the Great Depression, kind of defining what this period was like. We'll start with the stock market crash in 1929, which is traditionally marked as the beginning of the Great Depression. Even though there were signs before that, this is kind of the singular event that people look to and say, "Yeah, that's the beginning of the Great Depression." And that happened because there was this over speculation in stocks, and it kind of creates this bubble that burst, where stocks were overvalued. Because people kept buying stocks, and that pushed the prices up and up and up. And at some point, people stopped believing that the stocks were worth the price that people were paying, and the price started to fall. And that created this huge economic impact on mostly on the wealthy and upper middle class who had invested in the stock market. But then that kind of created the most visible sign that the economy was in a state of collapse. Now, the end date here, the U.S. entering World War II, because the United States is mobilizing for war. They're building ships and planes and all that kind of stuff, and it creates jobs from government spending. So that's kind of like the end of the Great Depression, effectively. Although the New Deal, which we'll talk about, was also a factor here too. All right. So in terms of what the Great Depression was like, one of the things that's important to remember about the Great Depression is the high rates of unemployment. I think it peaked at around 25%. And that there was this idea that, especially among men, this idea that they were self sufficient and had worked hard, and now they couldn't get a job. And so they were seen as helpless. They felt helpless. They felt ashamed that they couldn't get a job. And asking for help from the government was kind of like seen as like a weakness, like they were somehow less valuable, or it was their fault, that kind of idea. So this is kind of permeating a lot of the feelings among people, especially men, in the Great Depression. And at the beginning, there were private organizations like the Salvation Army and the Red Cross, kind of private charities that were helping people that were poor, with bread lines, basically providing food for poor people. But what happened is the Great Depression was so big that it overwhelmed these private charities, and so the laissez-faire supporters, who advocated for private charities to handle these kinds of things and not the government. What happened was these private charities were just overwhelmed and couldn't handle the demand. And at the time of the Great Depression, there was this kind of like, this continued belief that you could work your way out of this depression, even though that was really not a thing because it was so bad for everyone. So this kind of idea of the self-made man, that you could somehow survive the Great Depression if you just worked hard and tried hard enough. But also there are other people that kind of blamed the corporations and big businesses and banks and that sort of thing for the Great Depression, and kind of use them as a kind of a scapegoat, saying like it's their fault for their policies of having easy credit and encouraging purchase of stocks and not using their money wisely. So there's plenty of blame for the kind of elites of the time as well. All right, so a couple of different groups of people here that we should be aware of. African Americans during the Great Depression. This continued that great migration north. If anything, it kind of accelerated a little bit. So you had African Americans leaving the South and moving to the North for economic opportunities, where there was maybe slightly less discrimination. There was a very high unemployment rate among African Americans, mostly because at the time there was a movement among white Americans to say like African Americans should be removed from their jobs and those jobs should be saved for white people. So it definitely was this job discrimination. There was some, the NAACP, which you might remember is founded in the early 1900s by people like W.E.B. Du Bois. They encouraged they encouraged African Americans to be able to join unions, the Congress of Industrial Organization, to help protect African American workers. We also have the Dust Bowl. This is in primarily the Midwest, or the Plains, I should say. So like Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, that sort of thing. So you had this drought where there was a lack of rain, and dust storms that were happening because the topsoil had been kind of stripped off after decades of farming in very harsh conditions. And these migration of Okies to California became migrant farm workers as well. Okay, we'll stop there.